The first scream ripped across the Arizona plain long before anyone saw the blood on the nun's leg. She stumbled through the dry grass outside Tombstone, clutching her skirts, eyes wide with a terror that didn't belong in any holy woman. Something moved in the dust at her feet. Then the sound came, that angry dry rattle that makes a soul freeze even under the burning summer sun. The rattlesnake struck once fast, sinking its fangs deep into the pale skin just above her boot. She slapped at the snake, but it was already sliding away, leaving 2 dark beads of venom swelling in her flesh. The convent walls were a mile behind her, the church bells silent, the nearest help, a lone rider moving cattle along the fence line. Thomas Granger was 48, a rancher with a sunburned neck and a heart that had already buried a wife and a son. He heard that scream and yanked his horse around so hard the animal reared. Then he spotted her black habit against the gold of the grass. A nun alone, folded over like a broken doll. By the time he slid from the saddle, the poison had already begun its slow, cruel climb. Her hands shook as she tried to stand. She failed. She looked up at the stranger, at the rough hands reaching for her, and shame fought with terror in her eyes. "The snake bit you high on the leg," he said, breath-tight. "If I don't, you die before sunset." Elinor knew what he meant. The wound sat under heavy black fabric, too far up for a decent touch. Her vows screamed at her. Modesty and obedience on all the rules that had kept her safe behind stone walls. Out here, the only rule was survival. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking, "don't make me do this." Thomas stared right back, jaw clenched. "Sister, I'm not asking for sin," he said. "I'm asking for permission to save your life." With trembling fingers, she gathered the skirt of her habit, lifting it just enough to bare the swollen flesh, tears spilling as she exposed more than any nun should. He dropped to his knees in the dust, knife flashing as he slit the fabric, pressing his mouth to the wound, spitting venom into the dirt. They were so focused on life and death that neither of them noticed the wagon rolling up the road, didn't see the 2 women standing in the back, mouths hanging open, didn't hear the driver curse under his breath at the sight of a rancher on his knees between a nun's legs. By the time Thomas looked up, the wagon was already whipping around, racing straight toward Tombstone with a story that would set the whole town on fire. If a man risks his name to save a nun's life, what will that town do to him when the story reaches their ears twisted and filthy? By sundown, the story had grown teeth. By the time the wagon rolled into Tombstone, folks were already talking about a rancher on his knees with his face up a nun's skirt. At the Crystal Star Saloon, men dropped their cards and leaned in close. Granger did what to Sister Elinor? Nobody had the facts, but that never stopped a thirsty town. Someone else swore she was crying. By the 3rd retelling, Thomas was not saving her life. He was ruining it. Sheriff Barton Clay stepped out of his office with a cigar in his teeth and greed in his eyes. Clay was the kind of man who could smell a scandal the way a buzzard smells death. He had never liked Thomas. Thomas had spoken too loud about stolen grazing lands the year before, and a sheriff who looked the other way. Now Clay had a gift dropped right in his lap. He walked straight to the little church where Sister Elinor lay on a narrow bed, pale but breathing. The bite was angry and red, but the fever had passed. She tried to sit up when he came in, clutching the blanket to her throat. "Did he touch you where he should not have, sister?" Clay asked. The question itself felt like a slap. Elinor shook her head, eyes flashing. "He saved my life," she said. "If Thomas Granger had not been there, I would be buried on Boot Hill by now." Clay didn't want that answer. He wanted a scandal he could ride like a stolen horse. He stepped back out into the sunlight and told the crowd what they were hungry to hear. Rancher took advantage of a woman of God. That was all it took. They dragged Thomas off his porch before he had even unsettled his horse. He didn't fight at first. He knew how this town worked. One angry sheriff, 3 loud drunks, and the truth didn't stand a chance. They shoved him through the door of the small stone jail, fists and elbows flying, one punch catching his jaw just enough to sting his pride. Some had once shared his table. He heard someone shout that a man like him ought to hang for what he did to aid. None. He heard another voice, softer, trying to cut through the noise. Eleanor, they would not let her near. Clay told him there would be a public hearing on Sunday right there in the square where the whipping post stood. Town wants a show. Granger, the sheriff said, better start praying. The jail sank into quiet. Thomas sat on the hard bunk, jaw throbbing, wondering how a few seconds of mercy could wreck a whole life. Late that night, the jail stayed quiet, but the church didn't. Father Michael woke to frantic knocking at the rectory door. When he opened it, Sister Eleanor stood there in the moonlight, hair damp with sweat, hands clenched in prayer. "Father, if you don't open that cell for an innocent man," she said, voice shaking, "I will kneel here on this step until the sun comes up." The old priest knew Sheriff Clay, knew his temper, knew his shortcuts with the truth. He closed his eyes for a long moment, then reached for the ring of keys hanging inside his study. A little while later, in the stone jailhouse, Thomas lifted his head at the sound of a lock turning slow and careful in the dark. If that door opened, would Thomas Granger walk out and let a nun and an old priest turn him into an outlaw? The key turned slow, like the hand using it was arguing with itself. The cell door creaked, and Thomas saw Father Michael first, his shoulders bowed under a worn black coat, candle shaking in his hand. Behind him, half hidden in the shadows, stood Sister Eleanor. Eyes wide, cheeks still pale from fever. "You have one chance to walk out of here, son," the priest said quietly. "I'm too old to stand against Sheriff Clay in the daylight, but I won't leave an innocent man in a cage at night." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice barely more than a breath. "Stand up," she whispered. "You can't stay here. They will hang you by Sunday." Thomas pushed himself to his feet, joint stiff, looking from the priest to the nun. "You sure you both want to carry this with me?" he asked. Father Michael sighed. "Some sins are keeping quiet," he said. "I would rather answer to God than to Sheriff Clay." He stepped out past the priest and the nun into the cool desert night. Eleanor walked ahead, moving fast for someone still weak. One hand pressed against the church bandage on her leg. Thomas followed close, ready to catch her if she stumbled. They slipped behind the livery stable where 2 horses waited. Not his horses. Too clean, too well-fed. These belonged to the church. Thomas reached into the small leather bag tied to his saddle and pulled out a dark glass bottle. "Laudanum," he said. "It won't heal you, but it will take the edge off the pain for a while." Eleanor hesitated only a second, then tipped the bitter liquid past her lips, coughing as it burned its way down. "They'll notice these are gone," he whispered. "Not before Sunday," she said. "By then, you'll be far from Tombstone." But Thomas shook his head. "I'm not running, not without clearing my name." She looked up at him, breath shaking in the cool night air. "Then we need proof," she said. "There is a Navajo boy on the far ridge. He herds goats up there, yet he saw everything. He saw the snake bite me. He saw you save me. Then find him and bring him back before the hearing." They mounted the horses and rode out of town, hooves soft in the sand, the church bells behind them chiming midnight. Eleanor held tight to the saddle horn, her habit whipping in the wind, every breath sounding like it cost her something. Thomas kept glancing over, worried she might fall, worried the fever might flare again. After a few miles, she finally spoke. "Thomas, if Clay's men find us first, they'll shoot you before they ask question." He gave a dry smile. "Ma'am, I've been shot at before, but never while riding with a nun." She actually laughed, a tired little sound that made the night feel warmer. They rode on toward the ridge, toward the boy, toward the only chance he had to stay a free man. But out there in the dark, a rustle in the brush made Thomas slow his horse. Someone was following, and it was not a friend. "If you're still here listening, take a sip of your tea and tell me what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from. And if you want the next part of this story, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next." They were still a few miles from the ridge when Thomas pulled his horse short. The sound in the brush came again, soft but steady, like someone trying too hard to stay quiet. Eleanor leaned in close, voice trembling. "Is it Clay's men?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He just listened. Then a small figure stepped out from behind a moss-white tree, a skinny boy with long black hair and a nervous stare. It was the kid Elinor had spoken of, a Navajo boy from the hills above town. His name was Jonah, about 10 or maybe 11, barefoot and quick on his feet, smelling of smoke and sheep. Behind him, a small knot of goats shifted nervously on the slope. He pointed at her leg. "Snake bit you." "I saw it," he said. His voice was small, but the truth in it was steady. Elinor smiled with relief. Thomas felt the weight on his chest ease just a little. They had a witness, a kid who had nothing to gain by lying. But before Thomas could say a word, Jonah grabbed his arm. "They're coming," he whispered. "3 riders, sheriff sent them." And just like that, the chase was on again. Thomas swung Jonah up onto his horse without a second thought. "Hold on tight, kid." The small weight pressed against his back for a moment, and his chest tightened. For just a heartbeat, it felt like his own. Boy again, the one he had buried on a hot, windless day years before. He grabbed Elinor's res and shouted for her to ride. They sped over the ridge, dust kicking behind them, the sun dropping fast, painting the desert gold. Behind them, the riders closed in, their shouts echoing across the rocks. At one point, Elinor stumbled in the saddle, her wound pulling hard. Thomas reached out, steadying her with one hand. "You stay with me," he said. "I'm not losing you tonight." Thomas pulled them behind the low wall. The riders thundered past, fooled by the dark, only the sound of horses breathing, and Elinor trying to catch her breath. Thomas looked at Jonah. "You ready to stand in front of a whole town and speak the truth?" Jonah nodded. "I ain't scared of Clay." Thomas smiled a tired smile. "Kid, that makes one of us." They waited until the night grew safe enough to travel again, then headed straight for Tombstone. Sunday morning the hearing would begin, and this time Thomas Granger would not be walking in alone. But as they approached the edge of town, Elinor pulled her horse to a stop. Her face had changed. Her hands were twisting at the reins. "Thomas," she whispered, "what if the truth frees you but destroys me?" And that was the kind of question a man could answer with his heart or his silence. So which one would Thomas choose? Thomas didn't look away from her. "The truth is not mine or yours," he said quietly. "It belongs to God and to that town. We carry it together or we both stay in chains." The whole town crowded into the square, hungry for a show. Sheriff Clay stood tall in his coat, acting like judge and jury. They dragged Thomas up in front of everyone, wrists tied, jaw set. Elinor stood near the church steps, wide as the chapel walls, hands twisted in a rosary. Jonah hovered behind her, eyes wide, taking in every angry face. Clay stepped forward. "This man disgraced a woman of God," he shouted. "He shamed our town." And before the gossip could rise, Elinor stepped out, voice trembling but loud. "That is a lie," she said. "If you hang him, the sin will be on you, not on him." The crowd murmured. "It's hard to enjoy a scandal when a nun is staring into your soul." The judge raised his hand. "We will hear witnesses." Jonah walked up small but steady. He told them about the rattlesnake, about the bite, about the blood and the panic. He told them how Thomas cut the cloth and sucked the poison, how there had been no laughing, no pleasure, only fear. One man in the crowd snorted. "You're really going to trust an Indian, kid?" he called out. The judge looked over his spectacles and fixed him with a tired stare. "I'm going to trust anyone who sounds like they remember what they saw," he said. "So far, that is more than I can say for some of you." Clay tried to shut him up, tried to call him a wild kid who didn't know what he saw. But then an old woman spoke up. She had seen the wagon racing in, had heard the women twisting the story for free drinks. Truth walks slow, but it always gets there. The judge finally spoke. "There is no crime here," he said. "This man is free, and this town ought to be ashamed of how quickly it chose dirt over facts. The town found out he had his own secrets with land and money. By Friday, the county men rode in and took Clay's badge. Folks went home quieter than they came. Later, at the edge of town, Elinor stood beside the stagecoach. Her bag was small, her heart anything but. She took a deep breath, then reached up and unlooped the simple wooden rosary from around her neck. The beads were worn smooth from years of fingers and prayers. She pressed it into Thomas's hand and closed his fingers around it. I've carried this since the day I took my vows, she said softly. I can't give you my life, but I can give you my prayers. She met his eyes. I love you, she said, but I gave my first yes to God. If I stay with you, I break that promise. If I go, I break something inside me. Thomas swallowed, his thumb moving over the old wooden beads. I reckon a man only gets 1 or 2 chances in life to do the right thing, he said, his voice low, even when it hurts like hell. This is mine. She nodded, tears bright but not falling. Real love sometimes means letting go, she whispered. He didn't trust his voice, so he just touched the brim of his hat in a small salute. The rosary still wrapped in his fist. She climbed aboard. The coat rolled away in a cloud of dust, and he raised his hat until she was only a memory against the sky. Out there under that Arizona sun, Thomas kept working his land a little more gentle, a little more watchful of lonely riders on the road. Elinor kept her vows in another town, but every rattlesnake story and every sermon carried a piece of him. So, let me ask you, would you speak the truth if it cost you everything? If this story touched you even a little, tap like, hit subscribe, and stay with me for more tales from the Old West. That's all the trail I've got for you today, partner. Ride easy till next time. Pour yourself another cup of coffee or tea, and tell me in the comments what time is it where you are, and where are you listening.